So, okay. Again, we're doing 2.3 and we're just starting this section. We're not gonna finish this today. You'll finish it tomorrow. But we're doing some graphing polynomials and I hope this is a review for you. So hopefully this is a nice chill day of just review. Okay, in order to start graphing polynomials, we have to talk about end behavior. We have to talk about even versus odd end behavior. Okay, when I'm talking about even and odd end behavior, I'm talking about how the graph ends. So I'm going to draw little pictures, okay? There are 4 situations that can happen. Basically, I'm drawing like a big graph and then I'm putting 4 little graphs inside of it to talk about my even versus my odd end behavior. Now, when we talked about even and odd before, we were talking about symmetry. We're not talking about symmetry here. We're just talking about the arrows and how the graph ends. I care about the end behavior. So your 2 options are even and odd, and then within those we have positive and negative. Okay. Even end behavior ends in the same direction, whether they're both going upwards or they're both going downwards. If it's positive, do you think it's upwards or downwards? Upwards, excellent. So if it's positive end behavior, they're both going upwards at the end. So if I follow those arrows, they should be heading upwards. If it's a negative even end behavior, they're both going down. The arrows in both directions are going down on either end of my graph. Okay, odd end behavior is they're going in opposite directions. When it's positive, it always ends going up. So positive odd behavior will also end going up to the right, but it will have started down. So it will still go in opposite directions, but it's going to end upwards. We're in 2.3. Okay. Similarly with negative end behavior, it's going to end downward. So if it's opposite, it's still going to end downward, but it's going to have started from high. This looks like negative odd behavior for you guys, right? Starts high and then ends low. I have to sometimes think backwards when I do that. Does that look like something you guys have done before? Amazing. I love to see that. So we'll talk about even and odd. So if I tell you to tell me if it's even or odd, this is what I'm talking about. Does it go in the same direction or does it go in opposite directions? Okay, so we're going to graph these on the calculator first. So go ahead and get your graphing calculator out. Again, this should be a bit of a review. So if you're like, I know what those are supposed to look like, awesome. But it's good to practice putting them into the calculator. Make sure everything's cleared out, everything's back to normal. And I'm going to start by graphing this first one, y equals parentheses x plus 3, parentheses x plus 1, parentheses x minus 2. All right. Make sure your window is normal, -10, +10 in all directions, or you can press zoom standard. Why did that? I always say press zoom standard and then it doesn't do what I want it to do. Why are you not my normal window? There we go. All right, I've got this little polynomial graph going on here. First thing I want to think about is it even or odd? What'd you say? Odd, very good. And is it positive or negative? Positive because it's ending up. So positive, odd, positive. I don't care what order those 2 words go in. So it's positive, odd. And then I also want to think about its zeros. Now we can go through and we can go second, trace, and find our zeros. Second, trace, 0. Then we'll go left bound, right bound. As I'm explaining this though, some of you might be like, Miss White, we already know what the zeros are. And I'm going to talk to you in 1 second. Calculator, please work for me. Let me try a different 0. This will be easier in a second because I think we know what the zeros are. 2. Okay, so I've got one of mine is 2. Do any of you without solving know what the other zeros are, Rosie? Amazing. And then 2. How do you know that, Rosie?
Because I don't know, you subtract it. Like the x should equal 0.
The x should equal 0. Does anyone want to add on to that? you get x by itself. Basically, you're taking the factors and then setting those equal to 0. So we're setting x plus 3 equal to 0. We're setting x plus 1 equal to 0. We're setting x minus 2 equal to 0. And those are all my zeros. So I can sketch a graph of it just like we have on the board. I'll put zeros at -1, -3, and +2. And then positive odd just means that I start low and I end high. So I am just going to sketch this little graph. Perfect. You guys already kind of know what's going on. I love that. All right, we're gonna go graph the next one. X plus 3 times x minus 2 squared. And I want you to think in your head, how is this different? I want you to just kind of brainstorm, how is this different? What do you think the graph's gonna look like? Some of you might know, some of you might remember, but if you don't, let's brainstorm. What do we think is gonna be different? I'm gonna press graph and oh, look what I see here. What's going on there? A bounce. Bounce where? At that 2, good. So that square means that we're gonna bounce it. Is this still positive odd? Yeah, still positive odd. Bless you. My zeros are now at -3 and 2, and that 2's got a little bounce on it. So I like to put, bless you, a little B there so that I know it bounces. So I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna put my zeros at -3 and at 2. I'm still starting low and ending high, but I'm gonna bounce on +2, so it's gonna stay above the x-axis. It doesn't cross over, it bounces. Bless you. I like to think about every time you have a 0, that's the only time you can touch or cross or approach that x-axis. If I have a 0, every so often someone will draw something like this and they'll draw like this, and they just kind of like cross whatever. You can't cross if there's no 0 there. That's like a bridge that you're not allowed to cross. So you have to only touch or cross when there are zeros there, when we have points. All right, let's do that last one really quick. Just humor me one more with this in the calculator. Again, if you think you know what that is, think about it, brainstorm. X minus 2 to the 3rd. So I got, oh, make sure you close your parentheses. All right, and now I graph it. Is this still positive odd? What are my zeros this time? 2, good. And what have your Algebra 2 teachers called this in the past? Do they call this anything special? So I just think of like, we're kind of doing like a cubic motion around that 0. I'll call it a snake. Sometimes we're kind of snaking through. You're not just simply crossing over, you're kind of like snaking, like I want to see a little bit of a cubic look there. So whatever makes you happy, you can write like a little C for cubic, so that I want to see that mimicked a little bit. It's not just a straight cross, it's a little like approaching, a little cubic function. So I like to know that. Okay, it sounds like you guys already have a great like understanding of this, so we're gonna graph a couple of these without using our calculator, and then we will go from there. Do you want me to keep narrating, or do you want to try these on your own and then check in with me? I can keep narrating. Okay, I'll keep narrating, and if you feel good, if you're on F here, you can pause the video and just come back in a minute. If you're with me, just you can ignore my voice and then check in when I tell you the answers on the board. This one says no calculator, so we're gonna do it without a calculator. So first thing I like to do is identify positive, negative, even, or odd. So if I'm looking at the equation to decide if it's positive or negative, you look out front. There's no negative there, so we're gonna call that positive. So we'll say positive. To decide if it's even or odd, you need to count how many x's you have, okay? So I've got 1 x here, another x, and then this x is being squared, so that's not just 1 x, it's 2 x's. So I'm up to 4 x's now. So 1, 2, and then this one's squared, so that's 3, 4. That means 4 is even. So I've got positive even. So my graph is gonna start high and end high. I'm gonna graph my zeros. I've got -3. I've got +2, and I've got -1. -1 has that square with it, so that's where I'm gonna bounce. So I'm gonna make sure to like really be careful at -1 to bounce and stay on whatever side of the x-axis that I'm on. All right, positive even, so I start high and I'm gonna end high. So I cross everywhere except for at that -1 where I'm gonna bounce, and then I cross back at 2, and it looks something like that. I don't care what your little like hills and mountains and humps and valleys, I don't care how deep they go or where they are, it's just a sketch. So all I care about are zeros and your end behavior, that's the only thing I'm graphing. So they can be about the same, like, lowness of your valley, or you can make them deeper or less deep, it does not matter to me. Is everybody okay with 1A or 2A? Alright, I'm gonna keep moving. It looks like we've got one more in factored form, which should be real easy. Alright, first thing I think, positive or negative. I've got a negative there, so it's gonna be negative, and now I'm gonna count my x's. I've got 1, this one's squared, so I'm at 3, and then this one's cubed, so I do 1, 2, 3 more, I'm at 6. So we're at negative even. So this time instead of starting high and ending high, we're gonna start low and end low. What are my zeros here?
0,
Oh, 0, -2, 3. Remember this guy, you set them equal to 0, so if I did -3x equals 0, you divide by -3 on both sides, so x would just cancel out to be 0. So if you have any x in the front, he just stays by himself. He is just 0. So I've got 0, -2, +3. Is there anything funny happening in any of these? Bounce, we're bouncing at -2. And then that 3, we're doing kind of that cubic function look. So we can't just cross right through, we've got to kind of snake our way through there. So negative even means I start low and I end low. Okay, so -2 is my bounce. So I'm going to be really focused here. I'm going to make sure I bounce here. I get to cross over at my 0, and then at my negative or my +3, I'm going to kind of cube through like that. Kind of funky looking, but you can tell that this is a cross and this is a cube. See how they look a little bit different? That's kind of what I want to see. All right, we probably just have time for maybe one more. Now, the rest of these we have to factor before we do any graphing. So I'm gonna factor these first. When I look to factor C, what do I do first? How do I factor that? Good, you have to do grouping this way, so I'm sure your Algebra 2 teachers have taught you differently. I just kind of group those two and I group those two. Some of you maybe just put a line down the middle. It doesn't matter to me as long as 2 of them are together and the other 2 are together. Then that's when we do our GCF there. So I'm gonna take an x squared out of the first 2 terms. So I'm left with x plus 3. And then I'm gonna take a -4 out of the second 2 terms, and again, I get x plus 3. Remember that you cannot do grouping if the inside parentheses don't end up matching. So if I got x plus 3 and then x minus 5, like I just would be like, I can't factor this. And I'll teach you other methods to deal with that later. But for right now, these match, which is awesome. So now I'm heading to combine them. So I get x squared minus 4, x plus 3. Now, as tempted as you might be to be like, I'm done, I found my factors, we've got to factor this x squared minus 4. We've got to factor that difference of squares. What does that factor down to? Good, x minus 2, x plus 2. And so that means my zeros here are going to be what? Good, -2, +2, -3. Do I have any bounces or cubic, anything that I need to watch? Nope, we just cross over nicely each time. Now, looking back at my original equation, when I do end behavior here, I look at this x to the third term. I look to the very, very first term. When it's not factored, you do not have to count your x's, just look at that first exponent. So here, I'm gonna look at this first exponent, it's odd, so my graph is odd, and it's a positive x cubed, but there's no negative out front, so we're gonna say positive odd. Again, I'm not counting x's here because it's not factored. Only when it's factored do you count x's. All right, so I'm gonna graph my zeros, -2, +2, -3, and I'm gonna go positive odd. So I'm gonna start low and end high, and I just cross over nicely each time. Cross, 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 cross. Pretend that one went through the line a little bit better. Okay. I think this is kind of a good place to time out. I'll catch up on these notes and finish them. Next class. If we have time, I'll start to 4, but I will not right now, and we'll see as it goes.